the same thing. So they actually emit growth factors that start generating blood vessels for themselves. And, well, what they're doing is they're taking, because they're uncontrolled growth and they're growing faster and faster and bigger, if they're forming tumors, they're acquiring more and more nutrients that would normally go to our other cells that aren't acting like pirates, right? So one of the things that happens is called angiogenesis. It happens normally anytime there are requirements for cells, and cancer cells are the same way. So they start developing their own blood supply. In fact, that's one of the therapies that's used. Not all the time, but there's some drugs that actually stop cancer from creating new blood cells, or making the need for new blood cells, which generate new blood cells. So, in fact, that's also why in terminal cancer you see a lot of people who kind of waste away. They're wasting away because all the nutrients are going to the cancer and not to their other cells. Now there's one hypothesis. There are many, but one of them is that there's this thing called the multiple hit model. Cancer just doesn't happen because of one mutation in a somatic cell. So a somatic cell is a non-germline cell. Somatic tissue, organs, muscles, bone, whatever it is, somatic tissue. Germline cells, of course, are sperm and eggs, and the organ systems that create those things. So the multiple hit model suggests that you actually need a whole bunch of different mutations to actually get cancer going. Especially if we consider, we learned about the checkpoint model in terms of the cell cycle, and there's all these different checkpoints that to make sure that things are happening properly. Okay. So, cancer detection. Example is multiple melanoma. Now, who out here likes to kind of hang out in the sunshine? I do. No one else, right? Okay. I'm just one big melanoma, it turns out. In fact, this is melanoma talking, so I want all of you to go out this weekend, if it's enjoyable, and lay out in the sun and see what you can do about developing multiple melanoma. You'll like it. It's good. They even have, it looks like there's actually some new treatment out that's pretty good. Okay, so obviously ultraviolet radiation is a carcinogen, we'll say. It directly damages DNA in the skin cells. Most skin cancers are pretty innocuous. They're not going to kill you, but melanoma will. Now, the trouble is, we've probably all got moles, and occasionally you might go to a dermatologist and have them checked, if you have lots of them, once a year. They might sample a few with a knife and check to see if everything's okay. And usually everything is. But you can get melanomas almost anywhere. Anybody here know who Bob Marley was? Okay. Okay, Bob, when they weren't trying to shoot him, cancer was trying to get him, and it did. he had a melanoma, I guess on the bottom of his foot, I think, or in his scalp. Didn't know it. Now, obviously, you might think, well, he's darker skinned and he's kind of protecting that. It doesn't work that way. Melatonin is what we have to when we get a suntan. Usually, people who originated from the tropics have darker, brownish skin as an adaptation. But in this case, he got it, and he died within. Usually, you die once it's metastatic. Anybody? What's metastatic again?
It moves to other organs.
Mm-hmm. So it moves around. Malignant means it's invasive. Okay. Now, he got it and he died. Usually, melanoma has had a very bad treatment regime. Usually, you're dead in about a year. It's very aggressive. It moves easily. Most people with melanoma, they die either from a brain tumor or a lung tumor. It gets everywhere. They've had some treatment. There's some new stuff with the immunotherapy. And it's actually extended medium life, I think an additional, I don't know, maybe 12 or 14 months, which is a lot. In fact, there's been a lot of people who've gone through immunotherapy where they get the immune system to go after the cancer, to the point where people are in remission permanently. So there's some good things going on with melanoma on that front, and a lot of other cancers as well. There's certain telltale signs about melanomas. If you have irregular marks on your skin, that's often a sign of melanoma. And then, of course, what they want to do is you want to catch it early so they can remove it before it starts digging down and spreading in the local area where it starts. Okay. Now, one thing they do, oftentimes, to figure out if there's cancer or not, is do a biopsy. Melanoma is an example. That's an easier biopsy. For others, they might think that, let's say someone might be showing liver enzyme problems, and they go in and they do a liver biopsy. That's not so nice. There are also certain characteristic proteins that may be found in your bloodstream that are a telltale sign of specific kinds of cancer. The whole deal with cancer really is figuring out a method of early detection. Now, if you think about let's say prostate cancer, they oftentimes check what's called the PSA level. The thing is, PSA, all it does is really tell you whether there's inflammation in the prostate cells. It doesn't actually tell you whether you have cancer or not. But if you have cancer, usually it elevates pretty significantly versus just as some guy ages, you get an enlarged prostate and maybe elevated PSA levels. They're also developing more and more tests to be able to monitor specific proteins that actually that are generated by specific cancers. One of the big problems with ovarian cancer is it doesn't show up until it doesn't start causing symptoms that a woman is aware of until it's often too late. But they're developing a test right now that hopefully will circumvent that problem, and they'll be able to actually detect it early. Of course, they're actually saying with a PSA test that they really shouldn't do it all that much, primarily because oftentimes you'll get, let's say, oh, there is a small prostate tumor there. But a lot of prostate cancers grow so slowly, and so doctors go in and, let's say, surgically remove them and actually cause more harm than letting them be, because a lot of those tumors, especially in older men, will not be the thing that kills them. It'll be something else, like heart disease or whatever, because they're so slow growing. And then there's other prostate cancers that are pretty aggressive, like the one that killed Frank Zappa. I don't know if you know who Frank Zappa was. Okay. Now, Steve Jobs was a pretty bright guy, but he was a damn idiot. He came from my generation. We were all damn idiots. We all lay out in the sun, took lots of drugs. And anyway, he developed a pancreatic cancer. Now, pancreatic cancer, it's deadly. But there's different kinds. He actually had one that wasn't the most aggressive. It was a treatable form of pancreatic cancer. And usually the first treatment is you go in and you remove the tumor, and then you start with a chemotherapeutic regimen. But being into healthy living, he decided, talked with his doctors, he decided to do a more naturopath sort of therapy. It didn't work. Went on for about a year, and in that time, of course, the cancer increased. Now, most pancreatic cancer, the time of detection until death is, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, 6 months. Very, very aggressive tumor, but not the kind he had. So, when he finally decided that it was time, okay, this naturopath therapy, you know, with multivitamins and all this kind of stuff that doesn't work, was tried. The tumor had metastasized and suddenly had tumors all over himself. Now, he managed to live for like 7 years. But he could still be among us if he had actually gone in and gotten treatment properly early on. It wasn't like doctors weren't telling him, you know, hey, you need to deal with this, buddy, but he just got it in his head that, oh, I don't want to be putting poisons in my body. Well, cancer, in a sense, is, well, kind of like a carnivore in your body instead. Okay, so in the past, there was they still do it. People would go to Mexico for what something is called Laetrile, which is a cyanogenic glycoside. It's a cyanin-producing compound that's found in apricot pits. And they were touting it as a cure-all for cancer. It didn't. All it did was release hydrogen cyanide and made you feel sick. It didn't do anything in terms of cancer. But, you know, when people like Steve McQueen died from that, he was a famous actor. But when you're faced with a death sentence, you'll try anything. So I understand that. Now, oftentimes, we use radiation therapy. And the radiation therapy is high energy particles like gamma rays. Sometimes they'll use certain drugs that are delivered directly to a tumor, or radionuclides like cobalt. They'll be beta particles, but you don't really have to know that. The main thing is that it's often used because radiation causes mutagens, okay? In other words, it starts making the cell act kind of funny. And if we remember about our tumor suppressor system, like the BRCA system or the P51 system, that they detect A cell that's kind of behaving hinky, it's got some certain properties on the cell surface that indicate that, oh, it's not acting right, and it actually should undergo apoptosis. Well, that's what radiation therapy does. It actually causes mutations in the cell, and then the cell comes into, it's like, oh, the immune system wakes up and says, oh, cell is no good, so it makes the cell commit suicide. That's how radiation therapy actually works. In fact, with a lot of this immunotherapy, they'll use a radiation on a tumor that they normally wouldn't, just to generate enough mutations so that the immunotherapy actually works better, because when there's more and more mutations, it's more likely the immune system is actually going to go after and destroy the cancer. Now, normally, depending on the kind of cancer, they usually oftentimes use radiation after surgery. But that's the basic approach. So you should think about, there's usually a question on when radiation therapy is effective or why it's effective. And it's mainly because it causes mutations that then get cleared out by the immune system. So it doesn't necessarily kill a cell immediately, but it makes the cell transparent to the immune system that then goes after it. So this is what I just talked about. Now, it doesn't work on cancers that have impaired cell suicide machinery. In other words, if you have a tumor suppressor gene, like a P51 or a BRCA, that normally would, if it's operating properly, detect any cells that are looking like they're cancer, this won't work on them, because it's the tumor suppressor gene that's actually mutated and not working properly. And so usually when that happens, there's a proliferation of different kinds of cancers and not just one kind of cancer that's likely to happen. Okay. There's standard chemotherapy. Standard chemotherapy is it's a broad approach. Usually it's a therapeutic agent that is toxic to all cells in your body, but to cancer cells more specifically. So oftentimes, with a chemotherapy therapeutic agent, the idea is to titrate so that it kills the cancer faster than it kills the person. Now, why would any of these things not work over time? I want you to go back to think about evolution and natural selection. Yeah?
The cancer cell would mutate to resist the therapy?
It's what?
It would mutate to resist.
Yeah, so there'd be mutations, and some individual cancer cells would actually have mutations that make it more resistant to the therapy. Exactly. So usually what happens is, nowadays they usually use a drug cocktail, which is a number of different chemotherapy agents, because they work on different pathways of the cells. So with cancer, usually what they're trying to do is find pathways that they can interrupt that perhaps our normal cells don't usually, we might have different pathways. So a drug cocktail, like let's say for anything like HIV, in the beginning they used to use one kind of drug, AZT, and then quickly you'd have resistance develop. And the same thing would happen with cancer. So now what they're doing is they're taking a bunch of different combinations of different drugs that work on different pathways. And like the cocktails they use on HIV, which isn't cancer, remember, But it works because it works on different pathways, and it's unlikely that you're going to have a virus that actually ends up with mutations that are adequate to protect it from all sorts of different therapeutic agents. So the same sort of thing is happening here. The drugs don't cause the mutations. The mutations happen naturally. Most mutations have no effect. Most mutations have bad effects, even for cancer. But if there's enough mutations over time, you're probably going to end up with one that doesn't give the cancer cell immunity or resistance, but it gives you, let's say, partial resistance. So you give a dose of it, instead of it killing everything, it kills, let's say, 99.9%, and there's still a few that are, if you gave it more of that drug, it would probably kill them all, but it doesn't. So they proliferate, leave more in the population, and then over time you get more and more mutations until finally it's completely resistant to any therapeutic agent whatsoever. Anybody who's had chemotherapy will probably tell you that it's lousy. They basically, like I said, they're titrating for standard chemotherapy. They're titrating so that they give enough to kill the cancer and not to kill the person. And so those agents are still basically toxins, and they cause all sorts of things like, well, hair loss is the least of it. Obviously nausea, immunosuppression, and sometimes they end up killing the patient by kind of destroying too much. Now, there are some chemotherapeutic agents that are targeted to specific kinds of cancers and specific kinds of pathways that normal cells don't have. So, this Herceptin for breast cancer blocks the function of an oncogene HER2. And usually people who take this don't necessarily have very many side effects. You might say, well, this is great, isn't it? No side effects. It's perfect. Now, I've been talking about mutations in general. Mutations, once cancer starts, doesn't mean that mutations stop, do they? So you have let's say, a targeted chemotherapeutic agent like Herceptin for breast cancer, and that's great. The thing is, if it doesn't kill all the cancer, there's still going to be new mutations being generated all the time, some of which are going to let the cancer cells survive, even in the presence of a Herceptin. And so, a lot of times, a cancer will have so many mutations that even though Herceptin will work on this one pathway for the specific kinds of gene that is functioning as an oncogene, it won't work on all these other new mutations because cancer is evolving. Okay? Just like individual organisms evolve. Selection is acting on individual organisms. The ones with traits that allow them to survive and reproduce more successfully leave more offspring, in this case, more cancer cells like themselves. Okay, what's the immunotherapy? Anybody? What do you think? What's immunotherapy? What's an immune system? Do you know what an immune system is? What does it do? Okay, exactly. So our immune system is not for just fighting off specific microbes like bacteria, viruses, whatever. Our immune system actually deals with crazy cells that are running away. Immune systems sometimes operate too much and start killing their own cells. So we have immune problems where, like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, where our body is attacking itself. But our immune system works on all kinds of different problems that might arise. Okay, so now remember, our cancer cells, they arise because they're our own cells that have just started going haywire in terms of replication. And the reason an immune therapy often doesn't work is that the immune system doesn't recognize cancer as a threat, especially if you have immune system tumor suppressor genes that are mutated and don't function properly. Okay? So, the thing is, there's been some work lately where they take on a person's own immune cells and using molecular technology, they insert certain genes in those cells so that from the person that has the cancer, so that it's engineered, those immune cells are actually engineered to recognize. Then they take those immune cells, they proliferate them in the lab, then they inject them back into the person. And hopefully those immune cells will proliferate and they'll also attack the cancer. That's the basis behind immunotherapy. Now, the problem oftentimes is that you do it and it still won't really amount an effective immune response. Or you got an immune response, but in the meantime, the cancer cells have actually mutated again, they've got more mutations, and that it doesn't kill all the cells. And what they've actually done in a lot of cases is they've used immunotherapy in conjunction with, let's say you have a solid tumor. If you hit it with radiation, it's going to create more mutations, and immunotherapy actually tends to work better once there's a threshold that's reached where there's enough mutation that says, oh, this is bad, let's go after it. Okay? So what they usually oftentimes do now with immunotherapy is they use it in conjunction with another mutagen that causes mutations in the cancer so that it becomes more apparent to the immune system. In fact, the melanoma therapy that's now working, that's really had a huge effect, is actually an immunotherapy. And they're using it more and more all the time. And they're getting better and better at it. I just read, what was it? I forget. It was some kid that had a type of cancer. I forget what she had. It was a little, she had a lymphoblastic leukemia, right. Now normally what they do with that is they destroy the child's immune system. They use a bone marrow transplant with a donor who's similar, let's say a sister or brother or something like that. And it rebuilds the bone marrow and then the immune system. And it's one way to cure lymphoblastic leukemia or any kind of blood cancer. But the first time they used it, it didn't work. I mean, it worked for a while. She went into remission, but then it came back. So they actually developed immunotherapy with the lymphoblastic leukemia, where they took the cells, they found what kind of different proteins on the outside of the immune cells look like. So it's usually a white blood cell that is actually mutated, that's the cancer, the blood cancer. And they took it in the lab, proliferated it, and now she's in remission. And she's been that way for about the last year, I guess. So she might survive. So there's a lot of hope for that. Who is this? I forget who it is. Anyway, a famous actor. A lot of patients go into remission for a while. Sometimes they go into remission. They've been in remission for, let's say, 5 years. Then they're considered cured. Okay, so this is ovarian cancer again. We kind of went over that. There's no good early detection test, but they're developing one that actually, a couple different ones that actually show some real promise, where it'll be detected early enough that they'll be able to eradicate it before it metastasizes. Of course, the problem is sometimes there's a lot of ovarian cancers that start out that never go anywhere. In fact, there's a lot of cancers that never go anywhere. They start, they form, let's say, a very small tumor, and it's pretty much the end of it. And so there's always the chance, of course, that early detection will mean you go in and surgically remove it when it actually would be fine just to leave it the way it is.
Why is early detection in quotes?
What?
Why was early detection in quotes?
Oh, let's see. Usually it spreads through the lymphatic system, which is part of our immune system. So ovarian, and then we have lymph nodes all over our body. Sometimes if you get a microbial disease, it'll, let's say, infect lymph nodes, and they'll get really big and hard. In fact, that's what bubonic plague actually targets lymph nodes, and with bubonic plague, they grow really large and dark, and that was the buboes. Okay, and they turn kind of really dark and black. Anyway, that's the basic problem with this. It's highly metastatic. No. Well, not entirely. I mentioned earlier that dogs, there's actually a kind of cancer that dogs can actually infect each other with. Whether it's because they're playing around and biting each other and they pass it on that way. Usually those dogs that are infected with that cancer, they don't die. It's a pretty slow-growing cancer. There's another one, as I mentioned, for Tasmanian devils, which are kind of marsupial, that's pretty much decimating the population in Tasmania and Australia. Okay, but there are really no human cancers that you can catch. However, there are a number of cancers that are caused actually by viruses. So remember, viruses insert their own DNA into a cell. Oh my. Okay. Let me turn this off. Okay, good. Sorry about that. So, there's a relative of HIV that actually causes tumors in the same family of viruses. So, if a virus is inserting its DNA into a cell's DNA, you can see that it could cause all sorts of problems. Now, normally it's just there so that it helps proliferate. It takes the cell's machinery and creates more virus particles, right? But it can also cause cancer. So a good one is this human papillomavirus. It causes genital warts, and that's about it. But it turns out that it's responsible for most cancers of the cervix, which is not necessarily a terrible killer cancer. It's not the most aggressive, but it used to kill a fair number of women. Well, they realized this, that this was what was causing these genital warts that sometimes turned into a cancerous tumor of the cervix. So they started inoculating people with it. Of course, there was a hue and cry among certain people because they were inoculating young girls who were, let's say, 9 or 10 or 11 years old. And there was a hue and cry because, oh, if you inoculate them, you're actually saying it's okay to have sex. And so a lot of parents wouldn't inoculate their kids. They still aren't. It's either a religious objection, something like that. And so, of course, that's not terrible, because if their daughters die because of their stupidity, it's kind of natural selection working in action, right? They're losing fewer offspring because their daughters are dying and they're not passing on their genes. Okay? Now that's a pretty terrible view to take, but people are dumb. I can't help that. It's also, in fact, this HPV not only causes cancer in women, it can cause cancer in men. In fact, throat cancer. Anybody hear of oral sex? Right?
Michael Douglas.
What?
Michael Douglas.
Yes.
He loves oral sex.
Right. That's right. Exactly. That's the kind of cancer he got. Okay? So, I guess you could say don't have oral sex, guys. I don't know. Okay. So, if you haven't been vaccinated with HPV, then you probably should be, just so you know. In fact, all kids should be vaccinated when they're 9 or 10 or 11 years old. And that'd be the end of that kind of cancer. Okay, so anyway, it's good for your daughters. It's actually good for your sons as well. And the ones who think it's immoral, they don't have to take it, and let them beware.
Is that the vaccine they give in threes?
What? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Three.
What is it?
They give them in 3 different shots.
Oh, okay.
Like a week apart or something.
Okay, so they give it in 3 different shots, like a lot of vaccines.
Professor?
Mm-hmm.
So my husband had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they distinguish, because there's different types of lymphoma, and they distinguish this lymphoma because of the presence of, I think it's Reed-Sternberg, which is it's a virus.
Uh-huh.
So, but I couldn't get the doctors to make that link that if you've had that virus, it gives you lymphoma. That's what I'm not.
Oh, yeah, it's, in fact, I think that's the one that actually, related to HIV. It's a retrovirus or RNA virus. It actually is often the cause of that kind of cancer.
Well, he doesn't have HIV.
No. But it's related to
Okay.
virus. It's HIV. It doesn't cause HIV.
Okay.
But it causes immune system cancers. In fact, it causes a lymphatic cancer, okay, which is Hodgkin's, which is it's basically a blood type of cancer. And it doesn't, there's not a whole lot of them, but it does. That's basically the cause of it. Whereas this other virus is related to HIV that actually causes this kind of Hodgkin's lymphoma.
So you got the virus sometime in your life, but it didn't necessarily manifest as an illness then.
And it might never. But if you do have it, it means you're certainly at increased risk. And in fact, I think it was first discovered in Japanese populations, as a matter of fact, as a cluster, saying, why are all these, why is this cancer more popular among Japanese individuals? And they, research started looking into it, Japanese researchers, as a matter of fact, and they actually discovered that there was a virus behind it that was actually causing the disease. Okay, and so that was one of the first examples where they actually discovered a virus could cause cancer. Now we know that there are a lot of different viruses that can cause cancer. Because they insert their genetic machinery into your own genes, and the cells, besides, let's say, killing the cells eventually, can cause the cells to also start to proliferate.
So there has to be other factors, right? I mean, there's people who have that Reed-Sternberg virus that are not going to get Hodgkin's, so that's
Yeah.
just a factor. And
It
then
probably
you
has
have
to do with the
mutations.
person's immune system. So, in fact, like HIV, usually HIV itself doesn't kill you. It's all these opportunistic infections. Well, one of the opportunistic infections was Kaposi sarcoma, which is a kind of skin cancer that your immune system just completely, normally just blocks all the time. The same thing was solid tumor lymphomas that are also caused by other viruses that the immune system, but if you're immunosuppressed, then you're probably more likely to get it. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why you might be actually immunosuppressed. Okay, good questions. Okay. Now remember, the only cancers that are actually heritable are in germline cells. In other words, they carry mutations that, when they're passed on to offspring, and the offspring develop, they're more likely to get that kind of cancer. It's usually a tumor suppressor mutation, something like that. So most mutations are in our somatic cells. They're not passed on. We get a mutation in one of our cells, a bunch of different mutations if it's a multiple hit model, and suddenly the cell's replicating out of control. Okay? So that's not going to obviously hurt your offspring, but it might kill you. Okay. But there are some cancers that are actually germline inherited. The best known one is retinoblastoma. Let's see. Now normally, you can get, it's on chromosome 13. It's an RB tumor suppressor protein that is mainly expressed in the cells of the eye, in the retina cells. A lot of times you can have what's called sporadic. These are basically, they just happen instead of being passed from one generation to the next. If the mutation happens on that specific gene, then it'll be passed on to your germline. But in this case, it is also hereditary. And I think you need, let's see, okay. So you need 2 copies, from what I understand, for it to actually cause a problem. Individuals with this, they usually start proliferating retinoblastoma tumors very early in life, and they end up blind. Okay. There's a pretty famous case, a guy named Daniel Kish, who got retinoblastoma when he was about a year, I guess less than a year old. They took out that eye. Another 10 months later, another one, so he ended up blind. You think, okay, that's terrible. Well, for some reason, he developed this clicking sound, and he used it much like bats use echolocation. I don't know if you've heard about him, he's called Batman. But he's actually been teaching other blind kids how to use it. You know, you think, okay, if I click you actually, well, he can develop a very, very effective method of actually seeing in the dark. Okay? In fact, he often goes out at night for a nice walk in the woods, where the rest of us will be stumbling around, and he's, you know, happy as a clam. Because he actually gets a really detailed image, not only the image, but also the texture. So he can easily differentiate between, let's say, this substance and something, let's say, softer, like this plastic. Okay? He can ride his bike. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. So, but
There's videos on YouTube.
oh yeah,
and, like,
exactly.
I don't really watch, but yeah.
Yeah. In fact, here, let me get one. Let's see. This is the tumor suppressor gene that's often responsible for breast cancers in women. Let's see. They belong to a class of genes known as tumor suppressor genes. The woman's risk of developing breast and/or ovarian cancer is greatly increased if she inherits a deleterious mutation. Men with these mutations also have an increased risk of breast cancer, and if they have these harmful genes, and you can get genetic tests. So, Angelina Jolie got a test and actually had both breasts removed. So, anyway, let's see what I want. Oh, okay. Hold on a second.